Welcome back to Our God and We. Before we get into the video, please take a second to subscribe or follow. It would mean the world to me and really help support this project. Thank you again and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome back to Our God and We. I'm your host, Stephen Stapleton. Today we are joined by Dr. Vincent Bacote. Dr. Bacote is a professor of theology and ethics at Wheaton College, where he currently teaches, writes, and leads the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, otherwise known as CACE. While spending his time writing on everything from Kuyper to eschatology and ethics, Dr. Bacote is also working on developing a documentary about Black Evangelicalism, and currently hosts his own podcast called The Link, Bridging Faith and Life with Dr. Vincent Bacote. Dr. Bacote, I am so excited you are here. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be on the show.
Thank you so much. So there are not many Christians in the world, I think, that have decided to go through higher education and specifically get a doctoral degree in their faith. So as always here, I kind of want to start at the beginning with your testimony. What were the beginnings of your faith like that eventually brought you to this point?
Sure. I grew up in a Baptist home. I was very interested in religious things, spiritual things from a young age. Probably having a kind of spiritual sensibility even by fourth, fifth grade. I read a lot, but also I believed. I probably became a Christian long before I was baptized. In classical Baptist fashion, I got baptized around the age 12. But then basically, if you think about my life trajectory, the goal was to be a good, faithful Christian person who does what God wants him to do, but a person who, going into college wanted to be a veterinarian. And so my undergrad degree is in biology. So I went to the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. While there, I was involved with the parachurch group, the Navigators. Very transformative for me. That's really where I learned about a deeper life of discipleship, and certainly knew that I wanted to, even if I were a veterinarian, I still wanted to be, always involved in a Bible study, involved in leading, something like that. At some point during my junior year, I had a moment where I thought about looking back, what I would call a sense of call to full-time Christian service. And then I had to decide really between, are you going to go this path towards full-time Christian service, or are you going to go to veterinary school? And so I graduated from the Citadel in 1987 with my degree in biology. I lived with a Navigator staff guy in Memphis, Tennessee. And part of my reason for doing that was to discern whether I was going to go to veterinary school or whether I was going to go to seminary. Probably a few months in, it was pretty clear that I was going to go to seminary. And at the time, I was thinking about being a pastor. And so fast forward 3 years later, I go to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. But right before getting there, I had a sense of, on the one hand, I knew I wanted to preach. The public speaking side of this has never been an issue. That was always part of the call. But the context, or what's home base, at the time, I couldn't name it as this, but this is what was happening. I was feeling a dissonance with pastoral ministry, a trajectory towards being a senior pastor, with that being home base. And so for me, what that meant then was going to TEDS, still thinking I'm going to be a senior pastor, but maybe somebody who's a senior pastor who finds ways to not just do what senior pastors do, but also to kind of speak to issues of public concern. And what happened was during my first year, someone said to me, Vince, a guy like you ought to get a PhD. And they laid out a vision as to why that could be the case. And that was turning on a light. That identified what was sort of the dissonance that I had coming into seminary. But here's the thing. Because of the way that I thought about calling and ministry at the time, and because of what I thought might not be, what I thought would get the approval of others in a way, especially people that are very important to me and that I told I was going to be a pastor, I was nervous about saying, hey, I'm going to be a professor instead of being a pastor. And really it took me like a year and a half. And while I was at Trinity, a lot of professors helped me. A lot of other people outside of Trinity helped me think through and recognize that one, it's an okay place to be a professor, and you can also do your preaching on the side. Because initially what I was thinking was, okay, well, maybe I need to be a full-time pastor and I need to be a full-time professor. Almost like, because, hey, you're supposed to do this pastor thing. And I remember someone who was a pastor saying, hey, that's a full-time job. And we need pastors, but we also need professors. And so that was immensely helpful for me, freeing for me. So that really set me on the trajectory towards getting a PhD, where home base would be being a professor, and out of that, teach, speak, write, lecture, have all these other domains of communication that I would do, but the home base being a professor. And so in 1995, I went to Drew University. Is where I started my PhD, and then I came to Wheaton in January of 2000 because my first child was born in August of '99. Couldn't really start at the same time we were having our first kid, and the school let me start in the middle of the year, and so now here I am in year 25. And in 2007, I became our director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics here at Wheaton. And so that's another hat that I wear. It's a great opportunity for me to sort of have that context for helping to be involved in facilitating moral discernment on campus and beyond. And if you're going to say what it's all about for me at this point, right? It's really about what does it mean to have a thoroughgoing faith, a faith that addresses the entirety of life, where you take belief seriously, where you take not belief for the sake of belief seriously, but belief that walks around, a holistic faith. So for me, it's really a life of holistic discipleship is kind of the way that I think about my trajectory.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, you mentioned that there was two specific moments in your life where people sort of spoke into your calling, in a sense. What do you think
those were two of the major ones?
Yeah. What do you think is the power, in a sense, of speaking into people's life, and then how have you done that or attempted to do that also within your professional life at Wheaton?
Great question. It's very powerful because we need other people in our lives. We need the encouragement of others. We need others to help us to know the way to go. So to me, it's very important because even if I have a crystal clear sense of my call, of my vision, my vocation, my purpose, etc., whatever discourse we use, I will probably do that a lot better if other people are giving me more perspective than my own. And sometimes if I'm certainly in the mode of discernment, especially if the people know me, them speaking into my life is very important. Help, whether it's posing questions about, well, did you think about this? And it's like, oh, I really didn't. Or it wasn't the way that I was seeing a certain situation. Or whether it's somebody just giving affirmation to what you do. Case in point, I taught Sunday school this past week, and someone said to me after it's over, we love it when you teach here. You need to keep doing this. So when someone says those kinds of things, those things are really helpful to you. They spur us on, and they're affirmations of how our gifts are being used in service of others. And so those things are really helpful. In terms of my own life, going all the way back to, honestly, the influence of the navigators in college for me, I knew I wanted to be involved in helping be formative for others. And so in whatever way I could be a guide for others. So certainly, I would say the ways one does it, to me, it's always a refining type of thing. And so depending upon the moment, depending upon the relationship, the way I will want to speak into something may be by just trying to get someone to consider a question and to talk about it and to kind of draw them out. Or it might be sharing what I think about something, or I might make a statement about something, about whether it's about character, whether it's about the society we're living in, whether it's about just navigating the world, whether it's sharing where I've been, things that I've learned. What I'm trying to do is not to create people in my image, but I'm trying to find ways to serve them, to help them to walk faithfully on their path. And so that's really what I try to do. And there are a lot of ways you can do that, right? It can be, hey, did you read this Bible verse? Or it can be, I might tell a story about, well, there was this situation that I recall, and this situation is illustrative of something, or it might be something that I just read about, and I'll say, hey, I just read this thing. What do you think about this thing I read about, how certain people succeed and other people blow things up, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so it's ways to help create a space that hopefully is one for reflection, illumination, and discernment. And certainly what I always want people to do is I want them to be ahead of where I was when I was their age.
Mm.
For sure. Not that I think that I was so far behind. It's just that there are things I just wish I knew. And so if I can let people know what I wish I knew when I was 20 or 21 or 25 or whatever, I'd like to try to pass those on. So obviously I can't, because I don't know what a person I'm talking to, I don't know the totality of their knowledge. I can't share everything that I think that person. If you just know all these things, you'll save yourself a lot of grief. So here's the entire curriculum of all of that.
Yeah.
Well, this would mean that somehow I had a godlike omniscience. I do not, and no one does. And so I don't want to have that kind of pretentiousness about me, nor do I want to have any sense of being indispensable, irreplaceable, etc. I think everyone's unique and has a place, but that doesn't mean that I'm the only person that can be helpful to someone, right? So I want to do my part in helping others. That's kind of how I think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very pastoral approach to theology, and one that I think is really needed, especially when you're thinking about these big existential questions of what is the like you teach Christian thought. What is the Christian tradition, which is a crazy undertaking for one semester. You do it so well.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. It's sort of moving kind of along those similar lines. When you got to Wheaton, you're teaching theology. What specifically drew you to ethics and public theology?
Oh, well, I'm in print on this one. But what it really was, it's a species of a faith that is not just limited to quote unquote things that people might traditionally think of as merely spiritual things. For me in college, what that meant was, hey, I'm a fan of rock music. I don't want to be, did I want to be a rock and roll star? I did. But I didn't want to be a rock and roll star, for all the debauchery side of it. All right. It was because, the immensity of the public spectacle, participating in that was more the thing. And also because, the music's cool. And, throughout the ages, there's always this interesting thing about culture and how do people navigate that. And so for me, how do I think about culture, particularly when it's not produced by Christians? How do I note the way that, if everyone's honest, everybody engages and appreciates in some way things that come from not merely the church, but also outside the church? And how can I appreciate things, but also be critical if necessary? And so, but how does one make a theological claim about that? Or, depending upon what a person's tradition is, there are Christian traditions that are more engaged in the public domain and others that are much more arm's length or back turned to the public domain. To me, the question was, Christians should care about what's going on in the world, the cultural formation, political engagement, seeking to make the world better. But how do you make an argument for that? How do you prove to a Christian that they should do that they ought to do that there's a theological permission is the language that I would use. There's theological permission for going into the public. Hey, can we go out in the public? Can we go into the public? Can we go into this door? And I would say, entering seminary, I didn't really have a great way of doing that. And similarly, honestly, I remember thinking, especially in the 80s and early 90s, how do you, in evangelical spaces, but not only evangelical spaces, how do you show that an issue like the question of race is not merely a special interest, but that this is something that's important for all Christians to care about? Well, that's one of those kinds of things, or that's a species of a larger thing that all Christians should care about. And I didn't really know how to do that. I didn't know how to do that in terms of talking about a Christian doctrine that might orient us toward that, or to make a certain kind of biblical argument for that. I knew that it made sense. I knew that people cared about certain public issues and didn't talk about other public issues. And so to me, it was very important. How do you talk about, can we be involved in the public? How do we perceive the public? How do we think about engaging the public? So I was always thinking about that. Rock and roll was just one of the doorways into that, because that's really a dimension of talking about culture. I mean, I could be talking about film. I could be talking about theater. I could be talking about dance. I could be talking about painting. But it's also talking about, okay, what about political life in a country like the United States, where if you're a citizen, you can run for office? Should a Christian do that? Should they not do that? Should they care about that? How should they just vote, but then say, I'm leaving it to other people? Yeah. How do you think about those things? And so all of that was what introduced me to, whether the language was faith and public life, whether it was public theology, or whether we're talking in a more meta way about theology and ethics being together. That's really, in a way, it's kind of been, some version of that has been what I have been thinking about. Just like I said earlier, what's it all about? Well, a faith that is not just merely vertically oriented, not merely horizontally oriented, a faith that's both. A faith where it's important to talk about how doctrine matters, but doctrine isn't there just for the articulation of it. Jesus said, follow me, not just know facts about me. The facts are important. But now what? What about those facts? What do you do with those facts? How do you go about your life as a result of those facts? What does it mean for those facts to cash out in the way you conduct your life? In all your domains of life. That's always some version of that. Is what, at least at an intuitional level, is what I was thinking a lot about, going back at least to college days.
Yeah, I think there's some segment, I believe, of the Christian populace that would say you leave your Christianity at the door when you enter politics or culture. Yeah. What do you say to them?
I would say, well, what are you bringing with you? You're bringing some set of commitments that are based on some idea about some kind of ultimate realities, about something, whether you call it theological, philosophical, cultural norms, whatever, there are certain commitments you have, certain beliefs that you have, you're bringing in the door with you.
Mm.
And those things are why you care about X, why you think we should prioritize Y, why you think you ought to function a certain way, why you think, how you think about how much can be accomplished in terms of politics.
Yeah.
And so I don't think the Christian needs to leave their faith at the door. The question is, how do you bring your faith in? So I think you could survey a bunch of Christians and people would say, I think it's important as a Christian for me to want to be involved in government in a way that is biblical. Okay, that tells you everything and nothing. And the reason it tells you everything and nothing is because, well, where in the Bible are they getting this? What are they emphasizing? What texts? What doctrines that emerge out of bringing text together or understanding the story in a coherent fashion? What are the things that are providing the lens on the public reality and also providing some kind of at least principles for thinking about who you are, why who you are there, how you function there, what you're after while you're there. None of that means that if you bring your faith to the door into politics, that your aspiration is a triumphalist aspiration. Because what if it's a public service aspiration? Yeah. I'll give you an example that I learned not far from where you're sitting. Almost 2 decades ago, I was going to Yale twice a year as part of a project called Faith is the Way of Life that Miroslav Volf put together. And as part of it, we talked about, okay, we're going to get together and talk about these different dimensions of faith that is lived out. And political life was one of them. So what we did one time was we went to then Senator Joe Lieberman's office. And no, actually, we were in D.C. when that happened. We met him in D.C. So we didn't go up to Connecticut. We talked about it there. We did it in D.C. So we went to his office, and here's why I'm mentioning Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman said the reason that he got involved in politics was because of the Jewish idea of tikkun olam, the repair of the world. In other words, this is a religious commitment that the world needs repair because something's happened, something's gone wrong since God's created it. And so that was his reason for thinking about how do I help participate in that? So there's a religious, theological view of that. Repair of the world is very different than saying transform and take over the world.
Absolutely.
So I think the question has to be, what are people doing biblically and theologically when they're doing this? In fact, I think a lot of times the problem that we have is I don't know how well, a certain percentage of Christians, greater than 50%, maybe greater than 70%, I haven't done any nationwide survey, so I have no numbers. so I'm speculating. But I would speculate that 60 to 70% of Christians would have a hard time giving you a well-articulated view about why Christians should be involved in politics. In other words, what is it about what you believe as a Christian that is the reason why you should do that? Can you connect the dots from what it is, you think about the entire Christian story from Genesis to Revelation, that whole narrative, and about the way we coherently talk about the faith, get doctrines out of that coherence. How's some dimensions of that, the reason why we should be involved in public life if we have access to public life? Because if you're in a place that's not like the United States, let's go with Saudi Arabia, for example. Not in the right family, so you're out, as in most people are out. Or even smaller family, North Korea. Pretty much everybody's out. The point is that as a Christian, your public influence is only going to be, no matter what your theology is, you will function like an alternative witness, like a kind of neo-Anabaptist or Anabaptist type of thing. That's the best thing you're going to be able to do, and to model that in some kind of way that gets the attention of others, maybe. But if you're in a place where citizens can run for office, all right, now what are the possibilities of what you can do? And so what is it about what Christians believe that makes that possible? And so I would say, here's a very low-hanging fruit way of thinking about it. What's the second greatest commandment? And of course, the second greatest commandment, by the way, other traditions, other religious traditions have something similar to it. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yep.
And love your neighbor as yourself is not spoken of. If all the law and the prophets are basically meaning that our horizontal practice are expressions of neighbor love, then the question is in what way does political life play some role in bringing good to our neighbors? And wanting for our neighbors what we would desire for ourselves. And so how can politics or public policies be a way of trying to, in some little way, bring good to others, or create the possibility for people to use their agency to pursue their own flourishing, or whatever way you want to talk about that? So that's one way. That's one way of making that connection. But I'm not generally a cynical person. You know this. But my sense is that the theological why for public engagement is not something that I have a lot of confidence that most Christians can do.
Yeah, I would agree. And that theological why is a question I think that most people, regardless of their religious affiliation, kind of need to answer in some extent for themselves. Even if you aren't Christian per se, you have to answer that theological why are you not a Christian? What is religion? Why is this an engagement that people take in? And why do people find, again, so much hope in the public sphere using religious symbols and symbolism? There is a sense where when people enter the public sphere with religious symbols, religious rhetoric, there is a sense of there is like a repairing of the world. And I guess I would ask you mentioned a domination versus a repairing. At what point?
There are other strategies, by the way. Those are the other
100%.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that, lest sometimes all I heard was repair or take over. I was like, well, these are like for instances, but
I just wonder. A lot of people, a lot of movements that have used religious rhetoric have often been looking towards a repair, but have operated in much more of a domination. Yeah. And so I wonder where that line sort of lies.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of factors involved. One of them is, how are people learning how to respect being in places of influence, being near power, being near wealth, being able to use things that can perhaps make things happen, or being in context where people are telling you are really good at this. You should think about running for office or whatever it is, being in the corner office, whatever it is, and being able to understand that it's encouraging that people say that, but it's also a weight of responsibility when people say that. And also that there are particular temptations that come along with that. And being willing to ask that question and willing to have people in your life to tell you, maybe you should not, because if you do it, You know what's going to happen? Your head's just going to just get bigger and bigger is what's going to happen. Now, if you're not that person, if somebody says, wow, you know what, you really should do this because you really care about our neighborhood, you really care about our state, you care about our county, etc., then maybe somebody should then be encouraged. And then the question is, how are people coming around that person to help encourage them to do that? And so I think there have to be things in place to help us to be able to do those things well. And we also have to have in mind the fact that, all right, what do I realistically hope to have happen through what I'm doing if I'm in the political realm? Because no political system is going to fully establish the kingdom of God. No political system is going to eradicate everything. I mean, it's that hopefully they will mitigate lots of difficult things or be involved in that. But we see that every political system just isn't perfect. And because they are, we have to know that it's an imperfect enterprise that can do penultimate good at best.
Mm.
And so I think we need help to have that ongoing perspective about that. And in terms of why does it go wrong? I mean, I think a lot of times things go wrong because you don't have leaders that are aware of their own brokenness. So I was talking to someone yesterday about this. They were talking about the fact that there was someone who said the best leaders are people that are very aware of their own brokenness. And a lot of times there are people who are tremendously gifted who might acknowledge their brokenness, but they're not really aware of it. Or if they do, they're aware of it. They do their best to put up a force field around it so that nobody really either is aware of it or because they just don't want somebody poking around there. They want to kind of enjoy flying high with their gifts and then kind of let the chips fall where they may. But the important thing is flying high with their gifts. My point being that I think the question to me is not whether people should be participating in things. It's what else is happening to help people think with a kind of sobriety and humility about what participation means and what penultimate prospects might one pursue if they're involved in the political realm.
Yeah,
it's kind of how I think about that. Because a lot of times what happens when things go wrong is what goes wrong? Well, the usual things go wrong.
Mm.
People get intoxicated with it, or people have great ideas and they try, and sometimes they face great opposition, and the great opposition is just greater because of the moment that they're in. Sometimes they have an idealism but not a proper realism about what actually is necessary to be involved in getting political realities put into place or policy put into place. There's lots of things. There are a lot of people who I think who certainly have a position that access to power can only go wrong, or it's going to go wrong 90% of the time. I'm reluctant to be that pessimistic. Are there reasons for people to think that they've got good historical evidence for this being true? Well, this I cannot deny. But that's not the only stories to tell. There have been Christians who've been involved in politics who've been really good public servants.
Completely.
So I think I really do think the question is understanding where you are, what's really possible. What does it mean to try to be seeking the good of all people? And what does it mean if you're a Christian to relativize your political commitments in the sense that you don't make your political ends the ultimate ends? A Christian can't do that. A Christian's ultimate loyalties are to Jesus. And so you can't You can't make politics a rival for Jesus.
Yeah.
Nor should Jesus be there only to baptize whatever your political commitments are. Hopefully, Jesus is there to keep refining your political commitments and maybe alter your political commitment, maybe even change, overturn some of your political commitments. It depends. But I think when people are involved in political life, it's important to have the help of others to have perspective.
Completely. Kind of keeping along this sort of political theological through line that we're going down. Obviously, the evangelical movement is extremely important to your work and the things that you're doing. However, it feels as though today the evangelical, well, maybe it always was, the word evangelical is as politically effective as it is religiously effective. And I guess I would ask, where do you see the importance of the evangelical movement in the country today, and that importance continuing?
Well, the movement itself, I think it's fair to say that there have been leaders in the movement going back to the 40s, let's say, that have had engagement with political life. But they were generally telling their constituencies not to be involved.
Mm.
So they're the kind of political activism that people often associate now. It's just a much more complicated story. I would say the evangelical movement is something that exists because it's a kind of ecumenism. And when it's an ecumenism when it comes to thinking about how you'll have Lutherans and Episcopalians and Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Pentecostals who will all disagree probably about more things than they agree on, but they agree on fundamental commitments to the authority of the Bible and the importance of sharing your faith, the centrality of Christ's work on the cross, etc. And that ecumenism looks lots of different kinds of ways. There's still tons that people disagree with, but they have certain core commitments. The problem has been, there are many problems. I think part of the problem is that, going back to what I said earlier, I'm not sure that just because evangelicals got more involved in politics, they could all tell you why they should be doing it. So in other words, what's the relationship to being a United States citizen in a country with a Judeo-Christian background, where you've had lots of versions of cultural Christianity, not just Bible Belt cultural Christianity, in the history of the country, and how does having certain kind of presumptions about certain kind of, we're post-Christian in certain ways, so that you can't assume some of the things you could probably assume 70, 80 years ago. But what you could assume for a lot of the history is in this culture where, oh yeah, people talk about religion and stuff like that. And so I think there's been various kinds of cultural associations of God and the United States, and so in certain ways I think there's these cultural things that inform the ways that some people just have assumptions about the way that faith ought to be somehow involved in the country being what it's supposed to be in terms of its best self. But it's in the last decade or so where the politicization of the evangelical movement has included people who are not really thinking about Christian beliefs. They are thinking about certain sets of political commitments that they think evangelicals are the ones that have talked about them the most, and hey, I'm kind of for that, so I guess that kind of makes me an evangelical. Mm-hmm. I saw an article recently that's just showed that there were even 14% of people that were not Christian that were identifying as evangelicals.
It's crazy.
Why? Well, because there were a lot of survey questions, but I think it was because they were identifying in some way with certain public concerns that they think the evangelical is characteristic of, at least of white evangelicalism, even though white evangelicalism itself has more diversity than I think is often acknowledged. So I think the movement is fraught. It's in a crisis. There's been a lot of things that have happened, not just with the politicization of it, but I think within the movement, there's been ways that there have been failures in terms of really living out all these commitments, even while sort of trying to have a public moral voice, or at least there have been commitments. There's been ways that certain situations have been either covered up or just not addressed. And with all the sort of chickens coming home to roost on some of those things, it creates problems when you're a movement where you say we're Bible people, so we stand for what it says and what it says we should do. And if you're known for talking about certain kinds of morality in certain ways, and then you have leaders that tell people to obey those morality, but then are exceptions themselves in their own behavior, those things create a lot of problems. Those crises are not only in evangelical spaces, but I think they're intensified in evangelical spaces because it's like, well, you say you believe all this stuff, and you say that it's important to be a person of a certain kind of upright moral standing. And now look at what you're doing. So I think there's ways that people, are thinking about hypocrisy, or they're thinking about the political, it being so political to the right in certain ways. And there's ways that that's happened for some people where I think people who may have grown up in it saying, I thought what I should expect to see in the movement is, even if people are making mistakes, they own up to them. They're not covering them up. They're whatever. And so there's ways that some of those things have happened locally in terms of, the things that may never make the news, and ways that those things are happening publicly that contribute to a significant moment of crisis. But I think here's a complicating factor. What is one of the major critiques of the evangelical movement? Is that evangelicals are good at packaging the faith. Yeah. So a person who comes into an evangelical space is a person that gets this entry-level faith, but never goes much further than entry level. But they're good at talking about the entry-level things. In other words, very wide, not very deep. If you have people with breadth, but not a lot of depth in their formation, should we really be surprised that it actually doesn't work out in practice in accordance with the stated commitments, if the stated commitments haven't gone very deep? They're present, but they're broad while not being deep. In other words, it's going to reveal that you say these things, but it's like they're good things to say, and you kind of feel like it, and you kind of feel like you should be moral, but and you may even go to church a lot, but you don't go that deep. And so if that is true, if that obtains, I think, for the broader evangelical movement, in a way, people flailing all over the place in terms of not knowing what to do with power, politics, culture, etc., it's really not a surprise. Because do you actually have the depth of spiritual formation in this large population, where that depth of spiritual formation is leading people to understand that they're constantly growing and being transformed? They need to have humility about their own brokenness, and they can be deeply committed to truth, but they also want to be humble and caring in the way that they navigate things when things go wrong, etc. I mean, if that was the way things were going, I think people might say, I'm not quite sure what to make of these people. But if it seems like it's people who, you say you're committed to these things, but then when I'm looking at what you do, it's not clear whether your commitments are mostly coming from the Bible, or are they stated as coming from the Bible, but really there's other unspoken commitments that are the things that are really what is showing up, and showing up in ways that are dysfunctional. And those dysfunctional things, if you see them and you hear more about them, then it creates a huge conundrum. If people say, hey, we're these Bible people, but my other commitments lead me to live inconsistently in relationship to the thing I say is my greatest authority.
Mm. Yeah.
So in other words, it's complicated.
No, completely. That's fascinating. I wonder, I guess this will be my last question before my last question. Where do you see the differences as you're coming out with this documentary on Black evangelicalism?
Oh, that, yes.
Where do you see the differences between white evangelicalism and Black evangelicalism? Is there really a difference?
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
No, I mean, most people don't know.
Yeah. So one of the things that gets stated in the documentary is that there are a lot of people that you would call small e evangelicals.
Yeah.
They believe the things about the truthfulness of the Bible, centrality of Jesus, the need to share your faith, the need for encountering Christ's atoning work. All those things are being talked about, sung about in their churches, etc. But institutionally, they're not often present there, right? So a lot of traditional African American denominations are evangelical in belief, but they are not evangelical in terms of their institutional affiliations, their networks, etc. So you have that difference. But there are a lot of Black evangelicals, including a number of the people that I've interviewed, people who may have grown up in a National Baptist church, but now they're part of a multi-ethnic church, or they're going to some Bible church or whatever, or they might even go to a predominantly minority church, but the pastor, who might be a minority themselves, they do things that are clearly informed by a theological and kind of biblical formation that comes from going to seminary, like to Trinity, like I did or something. And so they're evangelical, but they're more culturally diverse. I would say, so that's part of the complication. But I would say one of the biggest differences is, even though you have had Black evangelicals going back to the 60s that have always mainly wanted to just say, hey, the important thing for us to do is just preach the word. I mean, this is in every tradition. Okay. And then you've had other people go, no, we've got to deal with what's happening out on the streets, etc. In terms of life experience, Black evangelicals at some point have to deal with having a kind of holistic faith that doesn't allow the luxury of the faith being mainly about believing the right things, and you selectively attend to certain kinds of ethical things. Basically because for many people, their experience in being Black in America, either themselves or not too far removed from them, they've got to deal with what you call the fact of survival. In other words, the fact of just living, and living in a way where one can flourish. When that's the case, you don't have the luxury of having a theology that's mainly about just speaking the truth. You have to have a truth that is lived, because is God saying something about what you're doing? Does God care about, if you're in this country that talks about liberty, you experiencing this liberty, etc.? You can't generally avoid that. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's political who's a Black evangelical, but I think there's some sense in which there's no space for, or minimal space for, I say, because I think you can probably find exceptions. There's minimal space for talking about being a Black evangelical and not thinking about some dimension of horizontal reality that you have to deal with. Some dimension of life out here, because you're just trying to have some kind of flourishing about life out here, and you have to deal with being in this modern world created by Europeans, where there are times when, even for all the language of liberty, your experience says, but even though we tell you you can fully participate, sometimes we want to say, well, we're not sure if it was that full of participation we want you to have in this modern world created by Europeans. And so when people still experience those things, and they're Black evangelicals, you don't have a luxury to say, yeah, God, should we not talk about those things? You have to talk about it.
Completely.
You have to talk about them. So I think that's a big thing. That said, it's important to note, I was trying to suggest it, there's diversity among Black evangelicals. Some people are going to be more prophetic, more politically oriented than others. Some are going to be thinking more about what you might just think of as traditional conceptions of thinking about church and mission, and you're thinking about just getting the word to people, and that's the main thing you're thinking about. And it has implications for other things, but you're mainly thinking about getting the word to people. You have other people who are thinking about, we've got to think about survival, as in like existential survival, life survival. And so we have to talk about the faith, in this holistic way. And of course, you have people, I think, starting to wind up swinging the pendulum between those things.
Yeah, completely. Going to our final question for today. And I want to thank you so much for your time, for answering all of these questions in the way that you did. It was incredibly insightful. Without naming a quote unquote correct or orthodox answer, I want to know why you specifically are a Christian.
Bottom line is, we're recording this as we in Lent on the way to Easter, is because I believe Jesus got up, and because he got up, then I got a deal. That's really what it comes down to. And so if he got up, then I have to contend with the one who got up. If he conquered death, then I have to deal with his claims. And I have to think about, if he is who he said he was, then I have to say, if he offers me life, am I going to say, well, thank you for this offer, I'll wait for someone else to conquer death? No, because we're still waiting for somebody else to do it. Now, some folks in Silicon Valley are trying. But he conquered death. And death is on borrowed time because of him. I sometimes think about, if people are having conversations about Christianity, it really comes down to, was Jesus a real person? Did he live in first century Palestine? Did he die on a Roman cross? Was he resurrected? Are the witnesses that are trustworthy about that? And if I trust those witnesses, then I have to deal. And if he claims that I can have life, and life eternal, and I can have a life where I'm internally transformed as a person, if I can have, significant healing in my own brokenness because of what he does, or because of, that's really a post-Pentecostal dimension because of the Spirit's work, if those things are happening, and I would say in my life they have happened, then I'm going with him. I'm not going to go with the other carnival barkers who offer nice, marvelous things that might, give me some nice flavor for a while, but like chewing gum, it's going to run out. Whereas with Jesus, the flavor is going to last forever. So that's kind of why am I a Christian? Because that's where life really is.
I love that. Thank you again so much for coming on the podcast. I would encourage everybody
I'm glad to participate.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody to check out Dr. Bacote's podcast, The Link, Bridging Faith and Life with Dr. Vincent Bacote. Thank you again. And that'll do it for today.
All right.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and follow. It really helps support me and the communal project of Our God and We. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time.